So again, welcome. My name is Andrew Crawford. I'm a policy counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I'll be joined for the majority of today's webinar by my colleague Alice Leiter, who's Vice President and Senior Counsel at the eHealth Initiative. As you can see from the agenda, we've got a packed hour for folks. I'll briefly walk through it. We're gonna have both Jen and Alex welcome everybody. We'll go through an overview of the project, what problem we set out to address, why we believe this work is so timely and important. I'll spend a little time walking through some of the specifics of the substance of the framework, including the definition, some of the protections that apply to the data that we're talking about, some of the exceptions that we've identified for those protections. We'll talk about some of the accountability framework mechanisms, what we plan to do for phase 2 of the work, and then we've left some time for questions. But before we start, I wanted to turn it over to Jennifer Kovich-Bordnick, who's CEO of the eHealth Initiative, and Alexander Reeve-Gibbons, who's the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, to welcome everyone. So Jen, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, Andy. On behalf of the eHealth Initiative Foundation and the Centers for Democracy and Technology, I'm delighted to share with you today the results of our year-long collaborative process, the culmination and the development of our consumer privacy framework for health data. As we begin this year, I think we all recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic has been the dominant issue facing most healthcare organizations and most businesses as a whole. COVID-19 has shown a spotlight on the potential privacy and discriminatory risks involved with the collection and sharing of health data. And as this project has highlighted, very often our federal laws are not providing enough protection. And we recognize that national privacy legislation has taken a backseat to the COVID crisis. But as the country begins to turn the corner on the crisis, we're very hopeful that our framework can serve as a roadmap for future discussion. Before turning it over, I want to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who had the foresight and the vision to really understand the importance of supporting this work. And particularly to our senior advisor there, Catherine Hempstead, who supported our work throughout the last year. I also want to thank EHI's own senior counsel and vice president, Alice Leiter, and CDT's Andy Crawford, who led the majority of this work on a day-to-day basis, led all the work groups, the multiple sessions that we had to have, and did a tremendous job engaging so many different stakeholder groups. And of course, Alexander Reeve-Gibbons, who I'm going to turn this over to in just a moment. The framework was developed through a very inclusive, collaborative, multi-stakeholder process. So all of the members of the steering committee who represented tech companies, genomic organizations, clinicians organizations, payers groups, way too many organizations to name one by one. But I do want to thank you for the time that you put into this, and we hope that you'll continue to stay engaged with us in phase 2. And then finally, to the general public that contributed their helpful comments throughout and your feedback, we hope again that you continue through us through the rest of this journey as we keep working on this important issue. So thank you in advance for your help as we get into the next phase, and you can hear more about that from Alice and Andy as we move forward today. And I'm delighted to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Reeve-Gibbons. Alex.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webcast. I'll echo my thanks from Jen to the folks who helped fund this, to all of the work. And I will say that of our steering committee, Jen mentioned the wide array of different companies and organizations that were involved. In addition to the industry voices at the table, we also had organizations advocating for privacy, consumer, and civil rights, and what led to a really fruitful conversation that continued through the public comment period. So we're so grateful for that input, and we do view this as a continuing conversation with continued input after today. So thank you in advance for joining in on that. I'll share just a couple of minutes of remarks of why we think this is so important. At CDT, one of the core areas that we focus on is a push for comprehensive privacy protections to protect people's data. And while we remain hopeful that Congress is going to finally act on that promise in the coming Congress to enact comprehensive privacy legislation, this framework plays an important role bridging the gap, offering consumers real protections today and showing what meaningful standards can look like in this space. it's clear that these protections are needed now. Just last month, federal regulators at the FTC settled a case with a popular app that, in contradiction to its stated privacy policy, allegedly shared sensitive health details on millions of users with third parties for years. This data potentially included consumers' names, email addresses, dates of birth, residence, along with extensive information about their bodies and their mental and physical health. Data like the dates of menstrual cycles, when pregnancy started and ended, menstrual and pregnancy-related symptoms, weight, and temperature. This framework is designed to raise the bar for corporate practices around the collection, use, and sharing of this sensitive data. Today, it's nearly impossible for consumers to manage and understand the privacy practices for every entity that collects, uses, or shares data about their health. As consumers in our daily lives, we all know the realities of notice fatigue. Many consumers simply don't engage with those notices. We all click I agree, or really feel like we have a meaningful choice but to opt in and accept those disclaimers, no matter how broad they are. With today's release, it's time to move past that unworkable paradigm and embrace sensible safeguards that people can rely on. The substantive standards that we focused on in this framework really do lead us in that direction, including strong limitations on secondary uses of consumer health information. You're going to hear more about that now, but again, we are so thrilled to present this work to you, to get your feedback, and to continue the conversation. If you identify ways to improve and strengthen the work, please let us know. And if you're a company that wants to talk about the best ways to voluntarily implement the framework, we'd love the chance to work with you. Thank you all so much, and Andy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Jen. So let's dive in. And actually, I'm going to turn it over to Alice to start.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Alex. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm going to start with a couple of slides running through what this project timeline looked like to date and explain a little bit about the context of why we thought the work was so necessary. Next slide. Again, as you've heard, we are so grateful to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, whose generous support made this project possible. And the grant was really designed to examine the legal landscape when it came to health data and identify the gaps in protection for consumer health information. We were aided by some colleagues at Manat who did a legal landscape overview shortly before we began our project. And so we were really able to pick up the ball and focus on solutions rather than identifying the gaps themselves. As Alex mentioned, this is explicitly not a legislative initiative, and it's really meant to support the momentum toward new federal data privacy legislation rather than replacing it. This work was meant to be something to shore up protections in the interim. As you also heard, we convened a steering committee made up of experts from across the healthcare technology and advocacy spectrum. We had tech companies, academics, consumer and patient representatives, civil rights organizations, privacy organizations, payers, providers. We were really grateful for and excited by the breadth of representation and, even more importantly, the engagement of those people once they joined our work. We kicked off about a year ago and had 2 steering committee meetings, formed 2 work groups that met regularly throughout the winter and spring, and we released a draft in August of 2020. I'm sure some of you were part of that. We're trying to make this presentation non-repetitive. In the 30-day public comment period that we opened after the draft was really terrific. We had several dozen of you submit really thoughtful comments that made our work better and stronger, and we're excited to release the final project today. On the next slide, you'll see a selection of the members of our steering committee. We want to be really clear, and we are explicitly clear in the framework itself, that lending the name to this project does not signify an endorsement of it. It is not an official sign-on to the work. In fact, one of the things that made this group so valuable was the candor of individual members, often in constructive criticism in addition to support. It was really important to us that we had conflicting opinions and that we did our best to strike a balance. So we're really thankful for everyone who joined us, who worked so hard to make this what it is, which we think is excellent, but also want to be very clear and protective of them that this signifies participation rather than an endorsement. On the next slide, you will see just a brief overview of of why this project is so necessary. Those of us on this call are likely familiar with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which has held up well over the past several decades since it has been implemented, but it really only protects health information when it is held by traditional healthcare system entities, by providers, by payers, and their contractors, which are known under the law as business associates. But importantly, HIPAA does not cover data once it leaves the traditional healthcare system. Once it is no longer in the possession of a doctor or an insurer or one of its contractors, it loses that HIPAA protection. And so then as a result, it does not apply to individuals and does not protect data held by individuals. Once you get your health record from your provider, whether that be a paper copy or over an email or through a portal or downloaded onto an app, even though it once was protected by HIPAA, it is no longer. And so with the proliferation of apps and wearable fitness devices, web tools that individuals use to manage their health, all of those are really terrific from an innovation and care standpoint, but very often, most often, they are not protected by HIPAA. That data is not protected by HIPAA because those entities are not covered by HIPAA. And as a result, we have this vast amount, increasing every day, of health information that is really underprotected. The FTC holds companies accountable for complying with their terms of use, but it was not set up to be the watchdog and the policeman for all health data out there in the world. And so as a result, very often, as Alex mentioned briefly, and as you'll hear about a little bit more, companies violate their terms of services with no consequences and without often the knowledge of individuals. There are state laws, of course, but they are patchy. Some of them are a little overprotective, some of them are a little underprotective, and very often they even conflict with each other. And so given this notice fatigue, again, that Alex mentioned, with these very long, very fine point, very dense terms of service, we can't have that be the only protection standing between an individual and his or her privacy. A number of our colleagues in the space have put forward over the years really excellent codes of conduct for companies to adhere to, or sets of industry best practices. And indeed, we looked to a lot of those existing work products to inform our work. Excuse me. The idea here, though, was that we wanted to go a step further, and we wanted our project to have a little more teeth than some of these codes of conduct or best practices, which are really just sort of voluntary and aspirational, rather than anything that it can really hold companies accountable. So on the next slide, you will see that even once we started this work, we found over the course of 2020 that it was even more urgent and relevant than we even had anticipated. We had new CMS and ONC regulations finalized, known as the information sharing and interoperability and information blocking rules, that once enacted will increase the amount of health data that's flowing from the health system to individuals. We're very supportive of individual rights of access and individuals taking ownership and control of their own health data, but it does increase this flow of information losing HIPAA protections. In December of last year, there was a proposed HIPAA rule release that it aims to increase information sharing with a broader array of members of the care team and caregivers without consent. Again, very supportive of information sharing, very supportive of information sharing for treatment and care purposes, but these increased audiences and people to whom information can be shared with does not come without its own privacy risks. Then, of course, we had COVID, which illustrated all sorts of challenges when it comes to information collection and use and sharing. And one of the really relevant ones to us was it really illustrated a fundamental lack of consumer trust. We had a number of different COVID tracking applications that were rolled out, but had very small, limited uptake by the public. Largely, the data showed due to a lack of trust of what would happen to that data and who would get it. So again, given that our project is specifically designed to shore up consumer protections and trust in protections of health data, that was quite relevant to our work. And then, of course, we had pre-election momentum on Capitol Hill that had been building for federal data privacy legislation. And now we find, in the wake of COVID, not even in the wake, in the midst of COVID, that we have a number of bills starting to gain traction on the Hill in this new administration, specifically related to COVID information, but also indicating the need for this more widespread, comprehensive data privacy legislation that has been needed for so long. On the next slide, for those who are visual, and just to really beat the dead horse of HIPAA versus non-HIPAA covered data, this is a visual representation of the universe of data that our framework addresses. We're looking at everything on the right: minimally regulated data, leaving the healthcare system, leaving HIPAA protections, held often by tech companies and regulated by the FTC, but not much else. Andy's going to talk a little bit on the next slide about some of the harms that this framework is designed to protect against.
Thanks, Alex. Alice. And yeah, before we really dive into the guts of the framework, we wanted to talk about the harms that we're trying to address. These are harms that, you know, consumers face all the time, folks like me and you, and this is the exact type of thing that our framework is looking to address. So throughout this slide, I'm going to use the example of a reproductive health smartphone app to illustrate a lot of these examples. As Alex mentioned, just last month, the FTC entered a settlement with one such app called Flow. But for folks who aren't that familiar with these apps, how do they work? What type of data do they collect? I'll walk you through some of the basics right now. So apps like these are used by millions of users. Sometimes they're free. Sometimes they have costs associated with them. In the case of Flow, it had over 100 million users worldwide and at least 16 million in the United States. Apps like these allow users to enter and log body functions, log their sex drive, log medications they're taking. Folks can even enter their mood, what they're feeling like. In the FTC filing against Flow, they noted that Flow encouraged millions of women to input extensive information about their bodies, about their mental, and about their physical health. And as Alex outlined, a lot of the data that they collected is really sensitive, beyond just names, email addresses, dates of birth, and residence, but sensitive information about menstrual cycles, pregnancies, symptoms, weight, and temperature. The apps also allow women and families to input data about their newborns, including names, geolocations of the birth, and whether there were any complications during the birth or the pregnancy. So when it came to Flow, what the FTC alleged was that the company harmed consumers because it made false and misleading representations to them. The FTC alleged specifically that Flow had represented to users that their information, these intimate details, would be kept safe and private. But in reality, the FTC alleged that the information was being shared with various third parties, including advertisers. So with that framework, we'll talk a little bit about the harms that are on the left side of the slide, and I'll start with embarrassment. As clearly demonstrated by Flow and other apps like it, this data can be very personal and sensitive, and it can be embarrassing if it's released and made public. There can be harms from creep into other areas of life. Again, with the reproductive health apps as an example, they show how this data can be shared with others. Sometimes this data can be shared with your employer, and that can have real life implications for your job or even your access to healthcare. There are concerns with inaccurate data. There's concerns with discriminatory health treatment. When not used appropriately, this data can exacerbate existing biases. There can be a loss of lack of autonomy. When data is shared with other parties, especially for unanticipated uses, consumers quickly lose control over their intimate health data. And finally, as Alice touched on, it can really lead to a lack of trust in technology and health services. These new technologies hold great promise for us, but inappropriate data use and appropriate sharing can result in consumers quickly losing faith and trust in these new and promising technologies. Turn it back to you.
We've come to save the day, and we think that the value proposition for our work is strong and obvious, but for those who need a little convincing, I will outline the key tenets of the value of this work. As we've mentioned a number of times, we really want to be clear that this is not a be-all and end-all solution, but rather a bridge to future federal legislation, which is much needed, and we will do all we can to support. We're also hopeful that some of the tenets of this framework can be used to help inform those efforts themselves. We think that this work significantly raises the bar for consumer privacy. It takes the burden of risk assumption off of the consumer and puts it on the companies, holding them accountable to a much more robust set of privacy standards than they otherwise would be. But it also holds significant benefit to the companies and organizations that are collecting and using the data. We've seen that can be a significant competitive market advantage to companies who have proven themselves to be privacy protective. As Andy just explained, if you get a reputation for being a company that's doing inappropriate things with very sensitive data, that certainly doesn't help you from a business perspective. And we'd like to flip it around and make this something that organizations are proud of and they use in their marketing and ultimately helps their bottom line. We also think, again, as I said, that if this becomes, if federal legislation is informed in whole or in part by some of the work that we've done, companies that join us on the front end are going to be ahead of the curve when it comes to being pro-privacy, privacy forward, and may have less work to do once legislation is finally enacted to catch up. And finally, we see this as a real benefit to regulators and oversight bodies. It allows them to focus their efforts on the most egregious bad actors. We're hopeful that our framework will funnel those violators to them rather than, again, putting them in this sort of overall watchdog role that they're not set up or staffed to fulfill. And with that, I will give it to Andy to run through the high points of the framework substance.
Thanks, Alice. And now that we've done the first 20 minutes, thank you all for sticking around. We've laid the predicate. Let's take a dive into some of the substance of the framework itself now. So as you've heard, to address these gaps in privacy protections and to address the harms that we've outlined, we set about working to develop this framework to better protect consumers' health information. The framework was a large undertaking. Many of you who participated know that. And as such, CDT and eHealth each focused on sections of the framework. So at CDT, we focused on the substance. What we're talking about there are the definitions, rules, and exceptions. And our colleagues at eHealth focused on identifying possible structures for the framework. And they focused their portion of the framework around self-regulatory approaches. So when it came to the substance, we really, I just want to take another opportunity to thank the work group, the steering committee, and the comments from the public, who all helped over the past year to contribute to the framework we're releasing today. Our framework, we believe, goes beyond older models that revolve primarily around notice and consent, and we did this to better protect consumer privacy. Some key areas where those enhanced protections come into play are around the framework's strong collection, use, and sharing limitations. These are especially prevalent around secondary, unanticipated, or unexpected data practices. Today, as we discuss the substance of the framework, I'm going to focus on 3 topics that are kind of at the heart, basically at the heart of the substance of the framework, that garnered the most attention, discussion, and were frankly some of the hardest sections to draft and to try to strike the proper balance. Those are namely the definition section, especially what type of data we're talking about and how we went about defining it, the rules that would apply to that data, and then some of the limited exceptions that are contemplated within the framework. But I also don't want to jettison the rest of the framework because there was a lot of work that went into that too. So other sections include provisions around transparency. There's provisions around consumer controls like access to data, ability to correct errors in data, ability to move and import data. And there's also general data security requirements in the framework. So veterans of this are familiar with this slide. Hopefully there's some new folks too. But this is just a visual representation, a continuum, if you will, of the data that we were thinking about as we went about drafting the actual definition of our framework. And as you move through the continuum, I'd argue that you'll see data that on its face is clearly health data, and then right around the middle, you cross the threshold where data on its face might not appear to be health data, but depending on how it's used, what the purpose of its collection and use are, how it's being shared, definitely have implications for consumers' mental or physical health. Our data system that we rely on, that we interact with every day, it's constantly evolving. And like I said, seemingly unrelated data can now be utilized to make extremely probative insights into consumers' physical and mental health. Data can be converted to health data based on how it's used. So to walk through this just briefly, starting on the left, you can consider data sets that were HIPAA covered records, right? These are literally your doctor's records, medical imagery, labs that are now able to be shared with consumers and moving outside of those traditional HIPAA covered entities. We've got DNA. These are things like consumer DNA test kits, kits that are offered to consumers at home. They're convenient to use. You've got data created by wearables, health equipment, health apps. These are things like, collecting data about vital signs, performance metrics, as we talked about a lot already, reproductive health. Moving into data created by other services and products. This can be things like your website browsing history, if you're researching a specific disease or condition. It can be your participation in an online support forum for a specific disease or condition. It can also be your geolocation data. If you frequent a clinic that specializes in a specific type of treatment, that information can be very probative into your current physical or mental health. There's also data that's created by AI and computer learning, and then data that's created, aggregated consumer data. Think big data brokers that are creating specific user profiles. So let's dive into the definition itself. Key to the framework is the definition for consumer health data. As we've discussed, there's vast amounts of data that currently fall outside of HIPAA's privacy protections. And when used in certain ways, that data can be very probative in individuals' physical or mental health and well-being. So as we approach the definition, we embraced a broad definition, a broad concept of consumer health information based on the purpose and use of health data. When we went about drafting the definition for consumer health information, we recognized that the data is sensitive and private, and if disclosed, it could potentially be embarrassing or enable various types of harms and discrimination. So when you drill down to it, our definition has two prongs. First, we started with a broad purpose and use-based prong that focuses on the nature of data and how it's used. This approach has several benefits. First, it impacts or it reflects modern data use that's complex, opaque, and happens instantaneously. Trying to delineate specific data sets, distinct data sets that are worthy of coverage and others that aren't just no longer make sense. Instead, our definition recognizes that all data can indeed be health data if it's used for those purposes. Second, the approach also gives the definition flexibility. It creates tech-neutral standards designed to stay relevant as technology evolves. Now, the second prong of our definition is designed to identify certain data sets that always constitute consumer health information. To that end, this portion of the definition declares certain sensitive health data shall always be subject to the framework, regardless of the context of its use. And within this section, we've included genetic data, data that reflects particular diseases or conditions, and we've included data that reflects disability, and we've defined it using the definition from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, we received a number of thoughtful and detailed comments about the definition section. As you can guess, several of the comments focused on the broad nature of the definition itself. And we took this feedback seriously. And to address some of those concerns, the definition's been refined. We've clarified when certain data sets, such as racial and biometric data, will be treated as consumer health information, for example. So moving beyond the definition, let's talk about collection and use. Currently, consumers bear the overwhelming burden of protecting their own privacy. Many privacy policies we encounter every day, they're dense, they can contain provisions that consumers miss, they gloss over, or they don't fully grasp or understand. So to help address this, we drafted the framework to permit data collection, disclosure, and use practices that center around consumer health information being used for limited purposes, consistent with what a consumer requests and what they expect. We know that limits on collection, disclosure, and use within this section are likely to curb some current behavioral advertising and commercial product development. And we understand this approach is more stringent than other voluntary frameworks or legal standards. But we believe health data warrants this type of protection. The data is just too sensitive. We've also drafted this section so that data collection, disclosure, and use limits carry through to third parties. Consumers should be protected without having to take burdensome additional steps to monitor how their data is being used by third parties. Again, the flow case is a good example of how data, once shared, can really quickly run out of consumers' control and even their knowledge of who has their data. So to address comments we received regarding this obligation for third parties, we've clarified the covered entities shall take reasonable efforts to contractually obligate third parties and service providers. This approach better aligns the framework with similar privacy protections found in other proposals found in industry, and it provides participating entities and consumers with a greater assurance that the framework's protections carry through to those third parties that may get their data. All right, so I've talked a long time. I got thirsty, but I'm going to give you an example now of how this would play out. So let's talk about a real life example where let's imagine, develop a wearable connected fitness device to help runners improve their fitness and their workouts. To do that, the device I've made monitors, collects, and stores data about a consumer's heart rate as they run, the pace they run at, and the geolocation of their runs, and allows the consumer to access that data via a smartphone app that I've developed in conjunction with the wearable. Under the framework, now that I've embraced it, as the device maker, I would only collect, disclose, or use consumer information for the purpose for which that data was originally collected, disclosed, or used, i.e. tracking a runner's workouts. The data I'm collecting is scoped to the purpose of the product. Moreover, within that limited universe of data that I've just talked about, I will further limit the amount of consumer health information I collect, disclose, or use to only what's necessary to provide the product or feature the consumer has requested. I'm only collecting data when the consumer's running. My wearable is not always on. If the consumer wants an address and they're going to reference their address book, I'm not importing every address from their contact list. I'm allowing the consumer to select an individual address and enter it. Again, the data is limited to only what's necessary. Finally, to the extent that I share any of that limited data with another party, I'm going to make all reasonable efforts to contractually obligate a third party and my service providers to meet the same standards that I'm committed to meeting. So unlike today, it wouldn't be possible for me to bury in the terms, of an already dense user agreement, any of these kind of provisions that would get around that. I also can't share the runner's data with the third party for unrelated purposes. So hopefully that example helps illustrate a little bit of how this works in practice. Back to some of the other comments we got, we received comments that raised concerns regarding how information that was at one time held and covered by HIPAA, talking about protected health information, should be treated under this section. And specifically, commenters raised concerns that a consumer's medical records, again, records that were once covered by HIPAA, held by a HIPAA covered entity, may well be shared in the future with another HIPAA covered entity after an intermediary stop outside of a HIPAA protection. And we recognize these concerns, and the framework is designed to operate outside of HIPAA and give consumers greater control over their health information. We encourage participating entities that collect, disclose, and use this type of record to ensure that consumers' rights are made clear to everyone via the framework's transparency requirements. Moreover, medical professionals who may receive this type of consumer health information should appreciate that it's the consumer, and not a HIPAA-covered entity, that's deciding what information they are sharing and then proceed accordingly. The third key component of our framework is the inclusion of limited exceptions that permit the collection, use, and sharing of some consumer health information. So as we drafted this section, we were certainly mindful of how exceptions can undercut the effectiveness of the overall framework. And these provisions borrow from longstanding laws that attempt to balance the equities between individual privacy and the societal benefits from the use of this type of health data, and also the participants' need to process data to deliver the services or products requested by an individual. So, for example, our framework allows for research. The framework contains an emergency use exception when there's a risk of death or serious bodily injury. There's also security and product functionality exceptions to ensure the consumer-facing tech is safe and that it works as intended. Now, we received several comments regarding how participating entities should handle employee data under the framework. And in response, we've included a new section that's designed to identify limited, specific instances where data may be collected, disclosed, and used outside of the framework's general provisions for limited employment-related purposes. Think entering an employee's sick leave request, for example. However, data about employees that is collected, disclosed, or used for any other purpose would fall outside this exception and is subject to the same protections as the covered data of any other person under the framework. And finally, we received several comments surrounding the use of consumer health information for commercial product development. We recognize that consumer health information can help entities develop innovative new products and services that consumers want. However, these commercial benefits must be properly balanced with consumers' rights. In an effort to strike that balance and permit limited commercial use, we've added language designed to promote strong consumer protections when consumer health information will be used by a participating entity solely for commercial purposes. To drill down even deeper, to best protect consumer privacy, this protection limits commercial development to aggregated and de-identified data, and it incorporates the framework's anti-discrimination and transparency provisions to ensure consumers won't be harmed and also know how their data will be used. Since this is a new section, we added this after the August draft was released. We look forward to continuing work with our partners and with the public to improve this provision if necessary. Overall, we understand that there are several equities at stake with this data, and we've drafted these provisions with our eyes open. We've worked hard to try to balance these between individual privacy and the societal benefits for the use of this data. And I'll take my final few moments to just thank everybody again. This has been a very labor-intensive year-long process where we've had many, many partners that have contributed greatly to this project. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take one final or yet another opportunity to thank everybody for their help and the public after our August release. So with that, Alice, I'll turn it over to you for a little bit.
Andy is an incredibly modest person, so he would never acknowledge that the bulk of the work fell to him and his team. This was a really Herculean task to get these standards written, to strike the balance between all of the various wonderfully engaged, incredibly helpful people, and then to incorporate the feedback that we got from the public comment period. The majority of it was very specific, very in the weeds in these standards, and Andy, you just did a fabulous job. I had a much easier task in working to figure out what the structure of the framework would look like and how we would hold member companies accountable. My work group was no less fabulous, but we were in much sort of quicker and easier agreement, which made this process a little bit more streamlined. Andy, if you go to the next slide, we pretty quickly thinking about a spectrum of do nothing to have a new law and where to fall in the middle of that spectrum for what kind of action we could take, landed on the idea of creating a self-regulatory body within healthcare, which has been talked about over the years, but never quite come to fruition. Self-regulation exists in a number of different industries, and we looked at models from the advertising industry and in some of the finance and financial service industries, and borrowed a lot of the tenets of these successful programs for our proposal. The idea is that we would form a voluntary membership body of leaders in healthcare and health tech companies that would be an independently operated and run organization, but also operate in alignment with the FTC. We would like this program to be housed in and run by an independent third-party organization that has experience standing up and running self-regulatory bodies like this one. That is yet to be determined, but we did think that it would lend credibility to our organization and help start a little farther along than if we tried to set up and stand up and organize the running of a brand new body. We would have enforcement handled internally through a number of stringent accountability mechanisms, but have it be understood that the FTC would be the ultimate backstop. Again, this is entirely voluntary, but we also want it to be quite public. There would be a widely promoted website that would list and promote members, but also make very clear what those standards to which they are obligated are and when they have run afoul of them. And so this public commitment would be a key tenet of this, because if it's not made public that the companies are following our privacy standards, both the value to consumers and the value to the companies themselves is somewhat diminished, if not lost. Our idea is that there would be a visual symbol associated with membership in this program, something like a good housekeeping seal of approval, so that, as an example, when a consumer went to the Apple App Store and wanted to download, for example, a period tracking app, they would see that X company has the special star of privacy standards, exemplary privacy behavior, and maybe, for example, the Flow app would not. And so then you would choose the one that has our star and be assured that the company to which you're handing your data is going to treat it responsibly. On the next slide, and I won't run through all of these in detail, but again, going back to what I said at the beginning about wanting this program to be one that had teeth, we really spent a lot of time fleshing out what the accountability metrics would look like for this body. Again, a lot of these tenets are borrowed from other programs that have been successful in other industries, specifically some of the advertising self-regulatory bodies. But we really want to emphasize to consumers that this is not a fox guarding the henhouse type situation, that this really is something that would have robust accountability and enforcement mechanisms baked into the program itself. Assessments, annual audits, spot check monitoring, this independent program staff, or running body would be key to putting these in place. Again, back to the public nature of this program, an active complaint gathering process, very clear statements of how complaints could be submitted, whether that be by a consumer or by another company, corrective action plans, a process to lose certification if that plan were to fail or not be complied with. Penalties for persistent or willful noncompliance would likely result in suspension. And we want to find some sort of a way to have there be a smooth referral process either to the FTC or to any relevant state AGs. Some of the logistics of this program are for a later phase of work, hopefully our next phase of work. We've talked a lot about how the program would be funded. It would likely require seed money for startup, but then depending on what the amount of that would be, we thought that there would be an annual membership fee that would probably be on a sliding scale based on the size of the company in terms of gross revenue. There are also, of course, a number of just logistical details of how it would be set up and run that we weren't able to nail down or flesh out at this stage because we have not selected an entity that would run it. We don't have any member companies. It's just an idea for right now. But the key component in getting the logistics right is thinking about this balance of meaningful protections for consumers, making sure consumers feel that the accountability is real, but making sure that we don't so far develop the sticks, so to speak, that we lose the carrots from members. We had a lot of really supportive members of our structure work group that said, this all looks great, but I would have to take this to somebody in my company and ask him or her to allow us to join, and I don't quite understand the business case. So again, we see in the value proposition that there is a commercial advantage to joining this body and to being a privacy all-star, so to speak. But there's more work to be done to be getting that balance quite right, just right, so that the consumers believe that this is something that really does meaningfully protect them, and that the companies believe that this is something that would meaningfully advantage them beyond just that it's the right thing to do. And that tees me up nicely to talk about phase 2 of our work. This, again, framework is something that we are incredibly proud of, and yet we would really love to bring it into fruition. And so what we're hopeful for in this next phase of work, Andy, if you go to the next slide, is that we capitalize on I didn't think there could be more attention to it, but this last year showed that it is not only a hot topic, but the hottest topic. Capitalize on the attention that the pandemic has placed on health data, how it's used, how it's collected, how it's disclosed, both for good and potentially for ill, and advance this framework. We would like to advocate for it, as we're doing now. We will probably have a number of other webinars that we will implore you to join, where we continue to beat the drum for this work. We want to continue to refine it, particularly when it comes to the engagement of consumers and consumer groups. Again, Self-regulation tends to be viewed pretty skeptically, yes, by consumer groups. And we've decided the best way to handle that is to just engage them and, address that skepticism head on and engage as many consumers as possible. We'd like a broader array of those groups, involved patient groups as well, which sometimes are a little bit of a different viewpoint than consumer groups. And we really explicitly want to focus on getting more representation from vulnerable communities, historically marginalized communities, some minority communities, because we've seen, particularly in the pandemic, but also know overall that there tends to be disparate treatment and impact of health data use and different effects of privacy violations on some of those communities. Again, as I just said, also, the framework self-regulatory program right now is a proposal, and we really would like to turn it into a fully developed extant self-regulatory initiative. So we'll be working on developing the criteria based on which we would evaluate and ultimately select an organization to house it. And then there will be significant work in recruiting individual members to join. Again, it's one thing for a company to say they're supportive of this, and it's another thing for the company to say that they are going to be a voluntarily self-certified member of the program. And that will be our task for the year ahead, is to get some members on board, and hopefully more than some. And finally, and I think most importantly, we'd really like to turn the lens of our work toward looking at and then researching and exploring in detail the ways in which those substantive standards of the framework that Andy so beautifully described can and should address inequities in the uses of consumers' health-related information. It should be that any harm falls equally to all, but it is not always the case. And we are really hopeful that in this next phase of work, we're not just looking to refine the standards across the board, but we're really looking to do it in the context of specifically identifying, calling out, and then protecting against inequities and disparities. So as everybody has said, but I will say again, we're not done. We really need you. The public and all of our peers and our steering committee and our friends have been instrumental in making this work what it has been. And we need you perhaps now more than ever as we try to advance this framework into something that is both even more meaningful and also a reality. So we hope that you have our contact information. But if you don't, it's on our website, as will be this presentation, the slide deck, the framework itself. And we urge you all to join us, to let us know what we've gotten right, to let us know what we have gotten wrong or what needs more work. And we're really just hopeful that we can have as collaborative and transparent a process for this next phase of work as we did the first time around. So I think we are now at time for questions. But a final thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thanks, Alice. And just a reminder to folks, we've got a little time for Q&A, and some folks have already put some questions in the box. If you've got questions, please feel free to enter them. We'll do our best to get through them, but as Alice said, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We want this to be an iterative, interactive process where folks dive into the framework, identify potential issues that they want to talk to us about, and please reach out to us. Just to make sure folks know, the frameworks should be live on the websites for both organizations now. So we encourage you to go take a look when you have the time to do so.
Andy, we also just sent a link out through the chat to the framework.
That's fantastic. Awesome. I can't see the chat, so that's even better. Thank you, Jen. But we'll try to tick through some of these questions now, and I'll just kind of start near the top, and I'll try to summarize these. But Adam was asking if we view this type of data, if we're really talking about it being covered with HIPAA and talking about disclosure subject to criminal penalties. Let me take a first stab at this, but Alice, also please feel free to weigh in. So Adam, what we're really trying to do with the framework is work with the data set that falls outside of HIPAA. So, right, like we've got a privacy law in place right now at the federal level that does arguably a pretty decent job of containing privacy protections for individual's health data when it's housed by a covered entity. What our framework's really trying to do is raise the standards for all the data that falls outside of HIPAA, all the data that's arguably just as probative into an individual's mental or physical health, but because it's not held by a covered entity, is not subject to those privacy protections. So that's what the framework's really trying to do at its core, is to raise those protections for consumers' privacy for the data that falls outside of HIPAA. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that one, Alice? So we've gotten a couple of other questions that are talking about how the framework is going to work with the interoperability rules. And Alice, I'll take a stab, but I welcome you to weigh in on this one too. We tend to cite the interoperability rules as an example of how this data ecosystem, this health data ecosystem is going to continue to grow, right? The interoperability rules are designed to encourage and empower patients to have more access to their data. What we want to make sure is that once that data leaves a HIPAA covered entity, there are meaningful privacy protections around it so that users continue to have confidence that their data is being used in appropriate ways and is not being shared as they don't intend for it, or any of the other protections that we've highlighted now and that are, we really drive into more detail in the framework itself.
Yeah, I would add that one of the discussions that has come up around how the interoperability rules are going to work in play is it going to be up to a provider to educate his or her patients about what kind of app they should be using? All health management apps are not created equal. And so our thought is that one of the ways that we would ease this concern that it's just yet another to do for a provider with already limited time is that this framework would be able to provide assurances to providers and ultimately to patients that the app that they're choosing to use to get this health information that, again, we're supportive of, that they're choosing the right one, that they're choosing one that provides similar, if not better, protections than that information enjoyed when it was lying in the provider's office and under the protection of HIPAA. We see that this framework is not an answer to all of the questions that these rules raise, but certainly something that can benefit directly both providers and consumers.
So the next set of questions focus around how the framework deals with critical data security needs to ensure privacy. And I direct folks to, I think it's page 17. There's robust security requirements that we've included within the substance of the framework itself. So I encourage folks to take a look at those. They're similar to a lot of the existing proposals that are out there. We've drafted them to be consistent with the data security proposals that are already in place, for instance, for folks who are complying with GDPR, for folks who are complying with CCPA. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at those security practices. And like we've been saying, if you identify or have questions with them, please feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to dive into those more. There's a really good question about tribal jurisdiction and how we weighed in on or contemplated the complexities of managing tribal health data jurisdictions. I think that's an excellent question and something that we're really looking forward to diving into in the next phase of this. What we did in the first phase was try to identify a framework that has real meaningful protections for everyone. But we also recognize that communities across the country, be it communities of color, communities of folks, the disabled community, tribal communities, have unique needs, and we want to make sure that the framework addresses those and raises the protections for everybody, while also not creating additional barriers. So please, I think Jackson asked this question, please reach out to us. I'm happy to continue to do these discussions, and we're really looking forward to building the framework out in that aspect as we move forward. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, Alice.
No, I think that was well said. Andy, I don't want to cherry pick questions for you, and I'm not looking at the list right now, but I did see a number of them pop up as we were talking that had to do with the logistics of the self-regulatory program. How would it be funded? How would it be run? Again, I'm just seeing little fragments of these, but I assume there are a number of those questions. And to those, I say, I'm really excited to work on this for another year and figure that all out. We really had our hands full with program design. Program implementation is a whole separate phase of work. It's what I'm really hopeful that my job will be made up of in the next year. All of those are good questions. They're real questions because none of this is going to work without funding, without members, without specific organizational logistics. And all I can say is that all of those were open questions during this past phase of our work, and the questions that I'm going to try to be answering along with Andy and our other colleagues over the course of the next year.
So I think we're going to draw to an end here. We're coming up on the hour, but I just wanted to, again, thank everybody. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I will, to the extent that folks' names are associated with them, I will do my best to make sure that we've reviewed them all. And if folks want to reach out, as Alice said, please don't hesitate. Our names and contact information are on the framework. They're on our organizational websites. We are really excited to have this document out in public today. And we hope that folks dive into it and let us know what they think. I'll just end with another thank you. And Alice, if you have anything else, otherwise, just thanks everybody.
Thanks very much. Talk to you all soon.